There is a figure that crosses cultures, centuries, and symbolism, a being that inhabits the border between what is known and what does not yet have a name. She is ancient, and antiquity, for those who know how to read it, is synonymous with depth. Today she is in front of an empty den, a den that, at some point, was a place of company. The marks are still there, different heights, different trails, signs of more than one presence that, together, made that space feel alive. Now there is only her, and the space, the exact same space, feels like something else. There is a word we use to describe many different experiences, and perhaps it is this lack of distinction that makes everything more confusing than it needs to be. Loneliness. We use it to describe the pain of having been left, and we use it to describe the peace of being quiet in one's own company. We use it for the night when no one answers the phone, and we use it for the calm morning when no one needs to answer anything. Two completely different experiences, the same word. Today the question we brought is about that difference, and about something that might seem strange at first, but that, looked at closely, may be one of the most freeing perceptions there is. What if the quality of being alone doesn't depend on whether or not someone else is present, but on the relationship you have with yourself right now? Let's enter that difference slowly. Have you ever been in the middle of a group of people? At a party, a family gathering, a dinner full of conversation, and suddenly felt a loneliness so intense it seemed bigger than any loneliness you'd ever felt alone? It's not rare, and it's one of the most disorienting experiences there is, because it contradicts the most basic logic we usually use about the subject. The logic that says, being accompanied is the opposite of being alone. That the mere presence of people nearby is enough for loneliness to disappear. And there, in the middle of people, laughing, talking, maybe even with someone sitting right next to you, you feel something that can only be described as loneliness. Sometimes even heavier than what you feel at home, alone, in ordinary silence. And perhaps you've also had the opposite experience. A moment, alone, with no one nearby, maybe even in an isolated place, where the feeling wasn't loneliness. It was company, not the company of another person, but something that, for lack of a better word, we call being okay with yourself. A feeling of wholeness, not because nothing was objectively missing, but because, in that moment, you weren't measuring your experience by the absence of another person. These two experiences, loneliness in a crowd and fullness alone, point to something that, examined carefully, changes the way we usually think about this whole subject. That the presence or absence of other people is not, in fact, the deciding factor. The deciding factor is something else. And that something else is what we're going to explore. There was a 20th century theologian named Paul Tillich who made a simple observation, but one that, once you hear it, is hard to stop seeing the world through. He noticed that language has a word for the pain of being alone, and that the same language doesn't have, or rarely uses, a different word for the possibility that being alone could also be something good, something full, even desirable. And when a language doesn't have a word for something, that usually means the culture that speaks that language also doesn't have much room to think about that thing. In other words, we learned, culturally, to treat being alone as synonymous with something is wrong, as if the presence of other people were the natural and desirable state, and their absence were always a deviation, temporary at best and permanent at worst. And this association is so deep that we often don't even notice it operating. But there is a difference between two types of experience that we both call being alone, and that difference is not about how many people are present. It is about what your relationship with yourself is in that moment. Think of a person who is alone and who, during that time, is at war with their own mind. The thoughts are critical. The internal narrative is one of insufficiency, that something is missing, that life should be different, that this solitude is proof that something went wrong. Every minute alone confirms a story this person already carries. The story that they are not enough, that they deserve company but don't have it, that the emptiness around them reflects an emptiness inside. This person is alone, and the loneliness hurts. It empties. Now think of a different person, alone in the same kind of external circumstance, perhaps even in an objectively more difficult, more isolated situation. But this person, in that moment, is not at war with their own mind. They are at peace with their own company, The thoughts that arise are received without the urgency that they need to be different. There is a sense, perhaps subtle, perhaps not even fully conscious, that being with themselves in this moment is not a problem to be solved. This person is also alone, but their solitude is something else entirely. It doesn't empty, it fills. The difference is not in the external space. The empty den, the silent house, the night with no one to talk to. The difference is in the internal space. It's whether, in that moment, the relationship you have with yourself is a relationship of war, where your own mind is a place from which you are trying to escape, and the presence of other people functions as a form of distraction from that internal war, or whether it is a relationship of peace where being with yourself is not something you need to escape from. And this explains why loneliness in a crowd is such a common and such a painful experience. Because in these cases, the presence of other people doesn't change the internal war. It just makes it more visible by contrast. You are surrounded by connection, or at least the appearance of it, and yet you feel alone with yourself because the relationship you have with yourself remains the same, whether you are surrounded by people or not. The presence of others didn't solve the problem, because the problem was never the absence of others. What if the question, how do I stop feeling lonely, is, without our realizing it, built on an assumption worth examining? The assumption is that loneliness is solved by company. That if you are feeling this specific pain, the solution is to find someone, anyone in some cases, whose presence will fill what is missing. And in some cases, this even helps temporarily. The presence of another person can distract from the internal war, can offer relief, can bring real comfort. But if the internal war doesn't change, if the relationship with yourself stays the same, the pain tends to return. Sometimes in the absence of company, sometimes even more confusingly in its presence. What if the real question weren't about how to get company? What if it were about what kind of company you are for yourself, right now, in this moment, regardless of who else is or isn't present? There is a way to test this idea that is simple, though not easy. Imagine spending some time, a few hours a day, completely alone with no form of external distraction. No phone, no music, no work to do. What appears in that space? For some people, what appears is immediate discomfort, an almost physical need to fill the space, to seek contact, to do anything other than be merely with themselves. And for other people, sometimes the same people at different moments in life, what appears after an initial period of restlessness is something else, a kind of settling. As if the mind, after searching outside for something and not finding it, began turning inward, and found there something that is not empty. The difference between these two reactions is not in the external fact, being alone. It is in how each person, in that moment, is relating to themselves. The first person is alone with someone they are, in some way, trying to escape, their own mind with its criticisms, its comparisons, its narrative of insufficiency. The second person is alone with someone they don't, in that moment, need to be at war with. And then the question changes shape entirely. It is no longer, how do I find company so I'm not alone? It becomes, what kind of company am I for myself? And what would need to change in this relationship so that being alone is no longer a threat, but a place where I can actually be? This question is not about becoming independent of other people. It's not about not needing anyone, or about relationships not matching. It's about something prior to that. About whether your relationship with yourself is itself a place you can be, or a place from which you are always, to some degree, trying to leave. There is a teaching attributed to the Buddha, near the end of his life, that is often summarized in a short phrase, but whose meaning goes far beyond any summary. The idea that each person should be their own lamp, their own refuge, not in the sense of isolation, not as a recommendation to avoid other people or traditions or teachings, but in the sense that, at the most fundamental level, there exists within each being a capacity for clarity, for presence, for discernment, that doesn't depend on any external source to exist, can be cultivated, can be forgotten, covered, neglected, but in its essence it is already there. And what this teaching suggests, among many other things, is that the relentless search for something outside oneself in order to feel whole can, paradoxically, be part of what prevents that sense of wholeness. Not because seeking connection is wrong. Connection is one of the most valuable experiences there is. But because, if the search for connection is driven by the belief that without it you are incomplete, then even when connection arrives, it arrives to fill a void that the belief itself created. And voids created by beliefs tend to reopen, because the belief is still there, underneath, waiting for the next moment of absence to show itself again. There's a distinction that might help here, between what we could call being your own refuge and being self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency, in the common sense of the word, usually suggests not needing anyone. A kind of fortress, an independence that takes pride in not depending on anything external. Being your own refuge is different. It's having, internally, a place of stability, not because you'll never need or want other people, but because that need or desire doesn't come from a place of desperate emptiness. It comes from a place of fullness that chooses to expand, to share, to connect, not because it has to, but because it wants to. And it's exactly here that the most beautiful paradox of this whole question lies. When you don't need the presence of other people to feel whole, when your relationship with yourself is already, to some extent, a place of peace, the presence of other people doesn't lose importance. It transforms. It stops being a need that, when unmet, generates pain. And it starts being something closer to a gift. Something that happens, that enriches, that is genuinely welcome, but that is not the foundation on which your internal stability is built. Relationships that come from this place, from fullness that expands, rather than emptiness seeking to be filled, tend to have a different quality. There's less fear in them, less need to control, to hold on, to make sure the other person won't leave, because if they do, the emptiness will return. And paradoxically, these are the relationships, the ones that don't come from desperate need, that tend to last, to have depth, to be experienced as real by both people. It's not a belief you adopt all at once. It's something you cultivate, slowly, with practice, with repeated moments of returning to yourself and discovering, gradually, that this return doesn't have to be a problem. And perhaps that's why so many traditions, not just Buddhism, but contemplative practices in general, from different origins, include, in some form, deliberate time in solitude. Not as punishment, not as forced isolation. As practice, as the repeated opportunity to discover that your own company, examined with enough gentleness and enough time, is not the emptiness it seemed to be at first. There's a way of thinking about all of this that might help make something concrete that, until now, may have seemed abstract. Think of someone you know, or have heard of, who seems to have a calm presence when alone, who doesn't seem desperate for company, but also doesn't seem distant or cold when someone approaches, who receives the presence of other people as something welcome, without clinging to it. That quality, that kind of stable center, doesn't come from not needing anyone. It comes from an internal relationship that is, in some way, already at home. And that quality is not a rare talent reserved for a few. It's something that develops through moments repeated over time, in which the person chooses to stay with themselves instead of fleeing. Not necessarily in big retreats. It can be in the small moments of the day. Pause before automatically picking up the phone. A moment of silence before turning on the TV out of habit. A moment, alone, in which instead of immediately seeking someone to fill the space, you simply stay and notice what's there. And maybe, at first, what's there is discomfort, restlessness, the old narrative that something is missing. But if you stay gently, without forcing, just present, something can gradually begin to change. Not all at once, not as a dramatic turning point, but like the den that, seen from one angle, seemed empty, and that, seen from another angle by the same animal in the same place, suddenly seems to be exactly what it is. A shelter. Enough. Hers. And from that place, not before it, but starting from it, the presence of other people can be received differently. Not as the thing that needs to be there so the emptiness doesn't show up, but as something that arrives, and that is welcome because there is room for it. A bird that approaches not because the tree was empty and needed a bird, but because the tree, being what it is, offers a place where the bird can land, if it wants, when it wants, without the tree needing that to keep being a tree. The question that remains, not as something to solve right away, but as something to carry and observe over the coming days, especially in moments when you find yourself alone, is this: in this moment of solitude, whatever it is, what is my relationship with the person who is here with me? And what would change if, just for an instant, I treated that company with the same gentleness I'd offer someone I love. If something here is still moving inside you, if some den that seemed empty felt, for a moment, a little more like home, perhaps it is worth continuing to walk this path. And if you would like, write in the comments a moment when you felt good in your own company, even if it was brief, even if it seems too small to mention. Sometimes naming these moments is the first step toward making them more frequent. I am certain that what you write will show someone else that this place, this company with oneself, is possible. The solitude that hurts and the solitude that heals are not two different things from the outside. They are the same thing seen from within in two different ways. And the difference always is in who arrives.